Today, we reflect on the attacks that have left an indelible mark on our nation. September 11th brought forth a global war on terror, challenged our civil liberties, and altered American foreign policy. After 22 years, what lessons have we learned, and how has it tested our democracy? Hello, I'm Saladin Ambar, and welcome to This Moment in Democracy. This episode was recorded on September 11th, 2023. Today's podcast will be a little different from our usual programming. Today, I'd like to share my own insights as a scholar of political science and professor at a state university, our beloved Rutgers. What have the past 2 decades taught us, and how has that fateful day in September shaped our nation? It has been 22 years since the morning of September 11th, 2001. Typically, for the students I teach, that's about the time it takes most of them to graduate college. When I think back of what the world was like for me at that time, it was a period of unbridled optimism. The Berlin Wall had fallen a few years earlier. Nelson Mandela was released from prison and had become the new president of a post-apartheid South Africa. Peace in Northern Ireland was on the horizon. The country had elected a fresh-faced governor, one of the youngest ever to be elected president, who promised to build a, quote, bridge to the 21st century. This was the beginning of the 90s, a relatively docile period whose most popular television series touted itself as, quote, a show about nothing. That moniker seemed to fit a period of something approaching political giddiness, the end of the Cold War, and the shot at a second new frontier that John F. Kennedy had promised decades earlier. I mention all of this simply to contextualize the dual nature of the disaster that afflicted Americans beginning on 9/11. The first was, of course, the obvious horror of a day no one old enough at that time can forget. I was teaching high school in Princeton when retrieving my mail before my first class in the main office, when I observed on the television mounted on the wall a smoking, gaping hole in one of the towers of the World Trade Center. There was some minor commotion about it in the office, but the presumption one most seemed to have at the time was that perhaps some drunken pilot of a small plane had made one of the greatest gaffes in aviation history. I was just beginning my lesson when my friend and colleague Gene Mosley knocked on my world history and cultures class door. He pulled me outside and shared that there was a second plane that crashed into the other tower and that the school's principal was about to make an announcement over the loudspeaker. I recall how few students had cell phones that day, how one of them, whose father, a Princeton University professor, was scheduled to be at the World Trade Center that morning, and she asked if she could leave to make a call. Thankfully, we later learned that Professor Don Speck-Gruber was all right. But we also later learned, later that evening, how many New Jerseyans lost their lives, their cars parked solemnly in lots next to New Jersey transit sites, unmoved, pockmarking with ghostly unevenness the otherwise mundane commuter's landscape of suburbia. The ghastliness of those days, told in countless stories on television, were painful enough. But somehow, I most remember that in the days after the attacks, walking into my local bagel shop in Plainsboro, a place usually filled with pleasant banter and vitality, now cloaked in grave silence, eyes glued to the television on the wall as wrapped rolls and bagels were handed to customers with the gravity of some bizarre communion taking place. Had this been all, 9/11 would have remained what it is, an awful and horrific day in world history, a day where terror punctured the sense of national invulnerability in a manner only rivaled by Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor, the day that lives in infamy, was followed by uncanny American political successes. The following 22 years from that date forward was marked by victory in the Second World War, a Marshall Plan, the building of an interstate highway, the desegregation of the military, and a civil rights movement that would produce a Civil Rights Act, all in that span. Such marvels did not follow after 9/11. A war of choice was waged under false pretenses, with the face of America further tarnished by images of torture from so-called black sites. Next, a great American city and its people were left to drown for weeks on end, it seemed. A few years after Hurricane Katrina, a new economic term was introduced to the American electorate, a Great Recession, with Wall Street bailed out, signifying some strange alteration in the nation's economic priorities had taken place. And when the next national crisis struck, we were left universally perplexed, half masked, half beguiled by a president who told us that bleach and lasers may be the cure for a strange pandemic wreaking havoc across the country. Finally, the very notion of democracy itself was nearly eradicated as the vice president and speaker of the House fled or cowered under an assault at the Capitol designed to decapitate the process of normal presidential succession, and with it, the very basis of the nation's rule of law. It turns out that 9/11, a moment of initial unity of purpose and communal suffering, was followed by the most dysfunctional political era since the Civil War. This is the twofold disaster from that time, that the United States of America and its Republican form of government hangs in the balance even at this very moment. The seedlings of that political harvest are too manifold to take on in this short segment, but what is clear is that despite the heroism of ordinary Americans from that September morning 22 years ago, firefighters, police, nurses, those who tended to the wounded and the dying, strangers, yet somehow made friends in the crucible of fire that was that day, all of those were let down by their government in the ensuing years. If nothing else, 9/11 should remind us of the kind of nation we want, the kind of world we aspire to belong to. It should serve to instill in us a redoubled effort, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain. The losses from that day can never be reclaimed, but a reversal of our present anti-democratic trend, the halting to that shift among many of our fellow citizens down the all-too-easy path of authoritarianism, may yet reclaim the possibility for a new birth of freedom. It is one that the memories of the thousands of victims from 9/11 so richly deserve. May we never forget. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This moment in democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. We want to hear from our listeners. Please email us at podcast@eagleton.rutgers.edu to send in your comments about today's episode or suggest topics that you want to hear about. Please help support the work we do at this moment in democracy. Visit our podcast page at eagleton.rutgers.edu to learn more.